Intro. Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in today. So today I have Luke Nowland. He's a personal trainer, owner of Nowland Performance in San Diego, California. He's got a BS in kinesiologist. He's a FRC instructor, instructor, which is just a class setting on FRC, and he's also a licensed sports nutritionist. What's up, brother? How's
it going?
How you doing, bro? Or LA, San Diego doing?
It's good. Weather's good. I mean, it's still kind of on some lockdown, here, but we're doing what we can, making the most of it.
It's San Diego's a nice town, man. 619. I remember I had a really close friend that was from San Diego.
Yeah, great city.
I went to high school in Ventura, so I kind of know Southern California.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Pretty similar.
Cool, man. So tell me. Yeah. Well, first off, in case anybody was listening and you don't know what kinesiology is, what's kinesiology?
Mm-hmm. Kinesiology, kind of in its overall form, is just really the study of movement. Really, the study more obviously focused on human movement and the things that kind of fall under that, right? So it could be exercise, biomechanics, really anything that involves the human in how they move and how they want to improve movement or alter movement, for whether it's sports specific ways or just to kind of get out of pain, live a better life ultimately, because we're here to move, of course. So really focusing on, like, for me, it's like the fitness side of like, because with San Diego State, where I went, there was, you could do physical therapy, you could do physical education, and I was a fitness specialist. So I was just really focused on how can we improve people's lives through health and fitness, and movement is kind of the basis for all that, right?
Yeah. And do you mind if I ask when you graduated?
Yeah, I graduated 2012.
Okay, not too long ago. Because I think back of when you listen to Dr. Andre Ospina from FRC talk about how science has changed compared to like 20 years ago. I remember when I first started, like some of the stuff that it's still kind of true, but like it's not so true anymore, but it's kind of true.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was the biggest thing. I mean, I tell people, like, I tell every trainer I can, to take the FRC, at least FRC, to get exposed to that, because that was kind of a big, in terms of my career and like how I look at the body and how I, look at I don't, strictly do FRC work with people. Of course, people, want to build, strength in certain areas and condition, but the way I think about the body and the way I think about training, FRC was really a pivotal point, kind of changing point for me in my career, because everything I learned in college, I mean, there's a lot of truth to it, but then you realize how much things are changing with new research and like how, they talk about like dynamic systems theory and all of these things that we never got exposed to in college. And even just looking at it from a joint perspective was something that you didn't really get a whole lot of in college. You kind of got like the nuts and bolts of like the kind of the basic things. But I mean, FRC and the way they approach the body and joint health, joint optimization was a huge, huge thing for me.
Yeah, I explained it. I was talking to a buddy of mine. You probably know of him. His name's John Platera. He's owner of the NCCPT, National Council for Certified Personal Trainers.
Sounds familiar.
I was explaining to him because he hadn't heard of FRC, and he's got every certification you can think of under the sun, and he's got a master's in sports science. So it's like, for everything that he knows, it's like, hey man, you should check these guys out. It's basically physical therapy, but kind of in a workout setting. So you learn how to like work out using like physical therapy applications so that it builds mobility and joint strength, which in then turn translates into actual strength to whatever activity that you want to do.
Yeah.
So your primary focus is, you do general health or do you actually deal with athletes as well?
So I got into it training athletes. I always thought I was going to be like a strength conditioning coach, so I was doing strength conditioning as an intern at my old high school here in San Diego. And we're, working with football and kind of athletes across the board. And as I was getting out of college, I was working with some athletes, like I've trained, like some like pro hockey players and things like that. But really the focus of my career in the last, say, 5 or 6 years has been kind of general health. I just see a much bigger need kind of across the board, just in my opinion, in terms of like how people put together the different aspects of health and fitness, right? So whether it is joint optimization, I mean, that's huge. And that's something that me, because I grew up kind of in the strength conditioning a lot of like some powerlifting, kind of even almost bodybuilding style training, I never looked at joint optimization. I never thought about, you know, like, oh, maybe I should be able to do these things, have the prerequisites to go overhead or to do these things. So it was always about strength and more power. So as I was getting more into like the mobility stuff, it was really like, okay, this is, I mean, for people to be able to move well for their whole life, I mean, that's, in my opinion, like one of the biggest factors to long-term kind of health and happiness, right? Is being able to move, being able to not be in pain, right? So, but then really just looking at, I mean, from a conditioning standpoint, a nutrition standpoint, a recovery standpoint, like I personally, within my own history and things that I did, I felt like that was a much bigger need for me to fill. So still work with some athletes. I'm working with, you know, a couple of football players right now, getting ready to go play college football, stuff like that. But across the board, general health, really kind of gen pop kind of fitness.
Yeah, and that seems to be like at least in the industry, I feel like that seems to be like the norm, unless you find that one like little niche where you're 100% working, and then it's like you work with like one pro athlete, and then that turns into like a whole crew of athletes. But usually that's usually the way it works, is where, at least from my experience over the last like 20 years, is you run into guys who's like, oh yeah, I worked with athletes, and then the general population ends up like kind of taking over because there's just more people. It's just
There's
a large
more.
market, you know, and it makes more sense.
Absolutely.
Plus, I feel like you also make bigger gains with the average Joe. The athlete, the gains are very marginal. And to be honest with you, from my experience, or from one spectating and me personally, like when I get into like that zone of like, all right, I'm gonna train like an athlete, it's really focused on recovery compared to like actual foundational work, kind of. They do
Yeah.
foundational work too, but it's really more about recovery for athletes, where I feel like the average Joe is more about 100% about foundational work, not really so much about recovery, because the average Joe just doesn't work as hard as the athlete. They just have a much more, I guess you can call it grit. I guess that would be like the proper word. But what about you? What do you think the difference is between like an athlete and like an average Joe person?
I mean, no, I would definitely kind of piggyback on what you said, where it's really like with the athlete, you're really looking to kind of get that last, like maybe 1-2%, you know, you're really just trying to kind of optimize what they have, ultimately keep them healthy, right? You know, you can really, you know, you can add, you know, some strength, maybe a little bit of like conditioning, you know, as they go like into their season, stuff like that. But a lot of times you work with those athletes, they've been training for so long that, you know, they have a very high training age, right? So it's like you can make changes and you can really help them. That's why again, why I love, you know, the mobility side of things, because a lot of people have never been exposed to this type of stuff before. You know, I took some pro athletes through like a lot of the kin stretch stuff, and they were like blown away, but just by how you could feel going into a 1 hour kin stretch class, and then, you know, just how much better even you could feel coming out of it, you know. So like that's really like what I love to show people, because people, they never know how good they could feel, right? So, and that's something that as you know, you can build strength, you can build conditioning, and you'll progress over time. But really looking at it from like a perspective of like giving them a novel stimulus, the kin stretch, the mobility stuff is something that may look on the surface like, oh, you know, I've done yoga and I've done these things, but it's really kind of a different kind of feel. But I mean, I was talking to my buddy, one of my colleagues just this morning about, I have one of my clients, and we're at like our 1 year mark of training together, and we're just doing once a week. But when we started a year ago, last May, she had never been in the gym in her life. She had never really done structured physical activity at any point in her life. And she's in her mid 50s now. So really the change that you can make. And, you know, he was like, yeah, you're changing her life. And it's like, it's easy to like forget that kind of thing when you're dealing with a lot of clients and you're bouncing around from session to session every day. But like when you really look back and you kind of think like, you are really, you can really alter the course of someone's life if they've made it 50 years and they've never done any type of physical activity for an extended period of time. They're feeling better. They're getting out of pain. Like, I mean, she came in just last week and she had like a pulled muscle from she works a pretty physical job. So we just kind of addressed that. We did some movement. We did some things. She came in today and she's like, she's like, if last week it was a 7 out of 10 pain, now it's a 1 out of 10, you know? So like those types of things, giving people the power back over their body just feels really great. And you can do that with athletes, of course.
100%, man. There's nothing.
Like,
That's why I love personal training. For a brief moment,
yeah.
I thought about getting into like the full-fledged like medical side of it. But then I was like, no, these people don't want to be here. Like there's a difference. Like when you're personal training, they want to be there. They're in the moment, and they want to see some gains. So even the clients that are horrible clients, they're still putting at least like a baby effort towards actually getting some type of goal. Where when I went to Memorial Hospital, and I used to teach for personal training certification, and the lady that used to come in and teach the cardio part was an exercise physiologist, and she would do like cardiac work. And so she's like, hey, you should come by. And I was like, oh yeah, cool. I went and checked it out, and I was like, yeah, these people don't want to be here. Like they're here because
they're forced to.
They're forced to, and they literally are just following directions because they almost died.
Yeah, and that could be a big motivator. But it is a definite, it's a difference of like, and that changes the whole energy of the session, and how much energy they put into things, and it kind of changes the rate of progression. All these different things that play into it, right? It's wanting to be there is such a big factor.
So let's put some like scenarios so that maybe you can kind of approach it and how you would handle things. So what I want to like kind of relay the message to my audience is because jiu-jitsu is very, how do I put it? It's a taxing sport where you need mobility, you need a little bit of strength, you need a little cardio conditioning. You kind of need all those things. And then there's also the skill level as well. What I feel like a lot of the average Joe people do, not everybody, but the average Joe do is that they go straight to the skill. In other words, they fine tune the process of the skill, which is important I feel like unless you're like a kid that starts like jiu-jitsu when you're like in your teens, you don't work on the physical aspect in conjunction with the skill aspect. You'll never maximize your skill level. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like if I were to come to you and I've never really, I've done some type of activity, I've done some workout, and I'm going to start jiu-jitsu, and I come to you and go, hey, listen, I'm doing this jiu-jitsu program. How do I need to change my program, or what should I do in order for me to be able to take care of my body and to be able to consistently learn from the jiu-jitsu process? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would always look at, kind of like I kind of touched on a little bit earlier, is like that total kind of package, right? So how does it fit in? Like how many times a week are you training? Are you going to be able to recover just from the training that you're doing, like from the standalone process, right? Like how's your nutrition? How's your sleep? Kind of making sure we get the kind of foundational principles met first, right? Because if you're not recovering, as you know, right, if you're not recovering from the training, the skill acquisition is just not going to be quite the same. But once we kind of make sure we have kind of the, the schedule set of like, how, your frequency of your skill type training, we'd want to start to like plug and play, kind of like what Dre speaks about with FRC is like, do you have the prerequisites, right? So, I think jiu-jitsu, it's probably one of the top one or two, probably the top sport in terms of like needing actual prerequisites to be able to say like externally rotate your hip, to be able to, get in like if you're rolling with somebody, right? Or be able to, control your ankles, be able to control your shoulder, like be able to get in these kind of awkward positions. And just like with other forms of training, right? Like putting yourself there in the skill is not the same as training to be there, when your body's put there, right? So I would look at it from like a perspective of like, okay, do an assessment, how does the body move? How do the joints function? Do you have the prerequisite motions to be able to be put in those positions, right? And then from there addressing, the conditioning, but those are things that we can layer on after the fact, right? But if you don't have the joint prerequisites, you're going to be put in positions that you can't control, that you can't absorb, and that you can't get out of. And then that's when injury is going to occur. And then you can't do any of it, if you get injured, right? So really looking at the foundational principles first of just general health, right? Training, nutrition, recovery, proper mindset, of how you're going to attack each session. But then from there, really, I would start with the training, with the joint prerequisites, with the mobility, right? And that's, as I'm sure, within jiu-jitsu, that mobility, kind of flexibility, kind of that difference, right? Of like, it's good to be flexible. That's the prerequisite for mobility. But if we can't control positions, we're setting ourselves up for
failure,
potential injury, right?
Yeah, something's going to go wrong.
Something, exactly. And it's just a matter of time, right? especially within jiu-jitsu, right? Like I started rock climbing in November, and that was the one for me that was like really enhanced my mobility practice, because I was like, you know, I can't get my foot here, I can't get my shoulder there, like all these things, right? So from a jiu-jitsu perspective, that's only going to help you kind of be in better positions to not only control the situation, but be able to kind of handle situations that you may not have otherwise been able to control before.
Yeah, there's quite a few actually jiu-jitsu people that are into rock climbing. I guess they kind of go like, I guess they complement each other. I
Yeah.
don't know. I've never done rock climbing. I'm too big for that. Like
Yeah.
I'm like 205. So it's like,
Yeah.
like I've tried rock climbing before, and it's like,
Tough.
it's the reward is not worth the effort for me, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Oh, yeah. Makes sense to me.
So then I go to the question of like how does someone approach like a year's time? Like, in other words, because here's where for the progression in the average jiu-jitsu like belt system. So we're talking like a 2-year per belt. So from a white belt all the way to a black belt, we're talking it's a 2-year stint within each belt, roughly.
Okay.
Usually you go a little faster at the very beginning, but it averages out to about 2 years at a time. So then it comes down to like, okay, let's say the average, again, I'm just guessing because I really don't know. I just go by what I see. The average jiu-jitsu practitioner, even if you're like a weekend warrior, you're going to go 2 to 4 times a week. If you're a heavy committed guy, you're going 5 to 6 days. And if you're like full-fledged competitor, you're doing 6 to 7 days a week, twice a day, in combination of yeah, it's quite a bit. So what I think is like how, like if I were to come to you and go, okay, well, what do we do? What are we going to plan for the next, from like white belt, who I've never done jiu-jitsu before, to like purple belt, which is, we're talking 4 years. What would be like the first thing we work on? And then from there, at what point should I reevaluate in order for me to add on additional stuff? And then at what point should I add on additional stuff? And then make it all something to where you can kind of consistently do things. Because I've tested stuff on myself, and I've already kind of learned, but I kind of want to hear your answer from just like the straight up, like, I don't do jiu-jitsu world.
Yeah.
And I'll kind of respond and let you know exactly what I've kind of tried on myself and how some shit does not work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it like you said, it starts out with knowing your timeline, right? So, okay, you know, if you got, say, 4 years, you know, or however long, you know, it would start with the assessment, of course, right? So really looking at, like we were talking about, I would do, you know, a joint assessment, right? So the FRA is really what I employ, you know, to look at from neck all the way down to the toes. How does the body function? How does the body function independently, right? And then, you know, doing any form of really whatever, like with jiu-jitsu, I'm sure they have more specific ones, but like a form of like conditioning, you know, to make sure that you have the aerobic kind of foundation kind of laid out. And that's something that you could continue to improve on, you know, as you go. But the thing with the like mobility improvements, right, is that it's slower than a lot of people like to think, right? Like, because you see a lot in the media, you know, of like foam roll your way to more mobility, like all these things. It's like it's instant changes, little improvements in range of motion is not the same as improving mobility, right? Improving strength at your end range, right? So people need to look at it just like it would be training, right? If you came to me and you're like, I want to improve, I want a 400-pound deadlift, and right now I'm at 135, you know, you would look at it from like a year by year standpoint versus like a month by month or session by session, right? So, so I would say, I mean, I would start with the, you know, the joint assessment, and then really look at what are prerequisites for, especially for jiu-jitsu. I mean, hip and shoulders is going to be the 2 biggest ones, right? So, hip internal, external rotation, right? So that would be kind of like that FRA kind of internally rotating the shoulder, externally rotating, and then if you get them on the table, usually with the supine kind of on their back position, internally, externally rotate the hip, kind of look at where we are for that, right? So, and a lot of times with assessment, it's how much do they need for their activity, right? So for the general population person, that's going to be a lot less than someone would need for jiu-jitsu, right? So you're going to need significant amount of internal, external rotation of the hip, and then in addition to everything laid on top of that. But I mean, I would look at it, probably chunk it down into like maybe like a 3 month kind of blocks of, you know, start with, you know, whatever their deficits were, whatever their most glaring needs are, really focusing on those. I mean, I tell people if you ideally, you'd be stretching, you'd be working on these things every day, and you could do, lower level pails and rails kind of type work every day, but really 2 hard sessions a week, of kind of max effort work on those specific joints, whatever, they were for you. And then we would look at, maybe 2-3 months down the road, do another assessment, look at where things are, how they've come along, and then over time start layering on, slightly more complexity and maybe a little bit more volume. Maybe you start to add in, other motions at other joints of the body. But it's really going to come down to where they started and then what the assessment shows, when you do those kind of check-ins down the road.
So what's your opinion on like then integrating external load? So let's say you do the joint assessment and you obviously work on hip and shoulder because you're right. Those are going to be the primary joints, especially at the very beginning. Ankle is the secondary one. A little bit of mild knee rotation because there's certain positions where the knee rotation with dorsal and plantar flexion are very important for certain positions in jiu-jitsu, especially if you're a particular player like that. So anybody that's watching, if you like butterfly guard or reverse de la Riva and de la Riva, a lot of dorsiflexion, a lot of small degrees of knee rotation as well. So those are things you would have to actually work on, but that's usually when you get a little bit more advanced in the jiu-jitsu realm. So you're right on that. When you come back, if you're starting out in jiu-jitsu, you want to start with the hip and the shoulder. And then depending on what your game or what your type of jiu-jitsu is, depends on which one is where you're going to focus on. Because the hip and shoulder are the primary movers, and then all the other joints are going to be secondary for those.
Definitely throw that spine in there too, right? That's another one, make sure you can flex and extend kind of
100%
rotation, obviously.
So let's say that, okay, you've gone through that, and then you want to start adding in some type of external load to increase power, in order for them to be able to then not only be mobile, but also be powerful with that mobility. So what do you think?
That would be something that from the beginning, right? If it's something that I'm working with, we're doing the joint by joint stuff, we're doing the mobility work, but then we're starting within the motions that they can do, right? So depending on because usually what I'll do with people is I'll take them through like a movement screen, a movement assessment as well. So we're looking at, squatting, hinging, kind of all these types of different movements, kind of the more standard model type training that you'll see. So, the ones that they do, the ones that they pass, the ones that they can do safely, we're starting, if it's someone who's very new, we're going to start, very at the basic levels, very, very basic kind of foundational movement patterns. But then really throwing those in really with conjunction within what they can do, from the start. So if it's someone who doesn't move very well and someone, we need to focus more on the mobility stuff, more on the movement, really looking at kind of more body weight style movements. But then if it's someone who really needs, like if they have, say, a shorter timeline, so like we're talking about, like, if you got 4 years, we're starting very foundational. We're starting very kind of functional in terms of like how they move and how they apply it to their sport. But then based on how their movement is and like how much time we have, we're going to start adding load pretty early on in the process. But then as we go, we're refining the movement, and then we're adding more complexity kind of as we go.
Yes. So a couple of things that for the jiu-jitsu audience is a couple of things you got to be wary of, because I personally experienced it myself. The very first one is the max effort that he was talking about with the 2 classes. You got to be really aware that it's a lot more taxing on the body than you are accustomed to where it almost, I wouldn't say that where you're like sore, but it makes you so like fatigued that it makes you lazy, if that makes sense. Like you're so like worn out from the max effort that you have to be like a little mindful of that, be prepared for that. If you start a mobility program anywhere, it doesn't matter if you're doing it online or if you're doing it in a class setting, just be mindful that when you do start doing that, that it's a different type of soreness. And the soreness is it's like a frazzled fatigue. Like, man, like I'm not really tired, but I just don't want to do anything. And then that can deter you from continue doing it because it made you lazy to actually do jujitsu. And I kind of want to just give like a PSA to make sure that you understand that it doesn't last forever. It takes about a month or so for your body to like adapt to that. And then all of a sudden you start seeing the actual mobility gains. But at the very beginning, you just have to be mindful that when you walk into it, that even though you think, oh, it's like, oh, this is nothing. What the fuck? I'm not doing just with my own arm weight. Like I can do that. And then you go do it and it's much harder than you think it is. And then the next day you're like, man, like, why does my upper body just feel like worn out? And then you go to train jujitsu and you're just feeling exhausted from doing the jujitsu. And then all of a sudden you come to that decision. Do I keep doing jujitsu or do I do the mobility work? And all of us doing jujitsu are going to pick jujitsu because we love jujitsu. But you just have to like understand that you need to endure that discomfort because in the long run, if you plan on doing like jujitsu forever, there's more upside than that initial downside that you feel at the very beginning. And as far as, go ahead.
I think that's a really great point. And I think that's kind of to piggyback on that, like how important it is to lay out a structure of your week, right? In terms of like, where are you going to put those sessions in conjunction with your training schedule, right? Because obviously you don't want to put that a day before, you got a really heavy training day, right? So that's just to kind of piggyback on that point. Like it is very new feeling. I mean, I still remember the first, like you said, probably the first month of doing consistent kin stretch classes or just my own pails rails type training. Like it's a very unique feeling. So, that's a great point. Just kind of being methodical about where you place it in your week in conjunction with your other training.
Yeah. And then also with the lifting is where I ran into a problem was because 20 years ago, I used to be like the bodybuilding mindset where it's like, maximum hypertrophy, so it was, I was lifting like that. And then what ended up happening is that I was just excessively sore because I did like, I don't know, it was chest or shoulders. I think it was chest and shoulders. I don't know what I did. It was something where the chest was involved. And so what ended up happening was I was basically tender, like my pecs were sore. And then I was rolling with somebody and he's a more advanced guy. So usually the more advanced you get, the more body aware you are usually. And so he didn't do anything wrong. I really didn't do anything wrong. I just was at such a disadvantage because my pec was sore to the point where I couldn't sustain like my normal tension in my arm. And then I ended up hurting my arm. So that's another thing that you got to kind of be cautious of because you can't, like, you got to like think the training, at least from my opinion, that the training should be more geared towards speed, agility, and power and not muscle growth. So don't like, if you gain muscle, that's like a side effect. Like that's great that actually happened, but really the jujitsu guy person needs to, like you said, focus first on mobility, get the prerequisite and the joint function working well. And then the next step is to then, if you're going to add in like a weightlifting regimen, whatever you decide to do, know that the goal is to not do weightlifting for muscle hypertrophy. It's to learn speed and power, and the speed and the power is a different type of lifting. You're not doing high reps, or if you are doing high reps, it's a lot of high reps, very high reps, and then transitioning to lower reps with slow and controlled, and then changing the tempo. So that old way of thinking of the bodybuilder where it's, I'm going to do chest and tricep, for 4 sets of 12 is the worst thing you can do for yourself when it comes to jujitsu. When it comes to looking sexy in the mirror, different story, and that's where you have to decide, like, if you're going to train like that, understand that you're putting your body at risk if you're doing jujitsu, because there's going to be days that you're going to have a good day in the gym and you tax the shit out of your chest. And then you go and do some normal movement that you do in jujitsu and boom, you basically tore one of your internal rotators or you tore your pec or something major just because you decided to go ham on your bodybuilding regimen and continue doing jujitsu.
Yeah, no, and that's huge. And I think that's a problem a lot of people run into, kind of across the board, whether they're, training for jujitsu Well, really, I mean, really a lot of sports, right? We have this mentality. I think it probably comes back from, the 70s, 80s model of like, okay, I'm in the gym, I'm training to build muscle, right? And like you said, if that's your goal, that's your goal. But if you're training for sport, if you're training for performance, it's going to look a lot different, than training for more muscle growth, more kind of just overall kind of hypertrophy, right? So really looking, and that's where it comes back to the assessment, right? Of like, what does this person need, right? Do they need more speed? Do they need more power? Do they need more, just kind of movement capacity, right? And that's where another thing, the mobility stuff is great for body control, but then also, that's one thing I was telling one of my clients this morning about, just like doing like a deadlift, right? Like the ability to pull in more motor units, right? More muscle fiber into one lift, right? You can train for strength and you can build power because it's so much neurological. You can gain a lot of strength and speed and power without adding a whole bunch of mass, right? And especially for someone who wants to maintain, say, a specific weight, like that's going to be something you want to train for. So it's, training faster at lighter weight, right? Or training lower reps if like more overall strength is your goal. But then also like we talked about with how do you place it in your week, right? A lot of people feel like they need to be in the gym 5 days a week lifting weights, to build strength, build power. But it's like, if you're doing kin stretch or mobility work and you're doing, 4, 5, 6 days, some even twice a day, of jujitsu, I mean, 2 days a week, you can make a lot of improvement, as long as your nutrition and your recovery is kind of in line, right? So that's I think a big misconception too, is people feel like they need to be, quote, in the, like living in the gym, right? But you can do a lot as long as your program is kind of like geared towards your specific goals, right? A lot of people do a lot of things that may go outside what they think they need because they think, like you said, they need 4 sets of 12 build strength, where really that's more about muscle growth. And that's probably not something a lot of people are really after. If jiu-jitsu is their main focus.
That's a good point. I didn't even think of that. But about the power and no change in actual muscle gain, which in turn doesn't allow you to gain weight, because a lot of especially if you're a competitor, you don't want to gain weight. You just want to gain power. So that's where, like, I remember I came across I forgot the guy's name now. Whatever. It's called the 5-3-1 method.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I know
You know who I'm talking about.
I know. Is it Jim Wendler? Was that him?
The Windler. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I found that to be very applicable to like the jiu-jitsu kind of community, because you get the effects of feeling strong without the effects of feeling like you're doing like massive muscle damage, because you're
huge.
You feel like wow, I just powered some weight here for a set of 3 or 4 or whatever the number is, but you don't feel that muscle, like focused muscle fatigue, either on the bicep or the chest or whatever it may be. And that's one of those programs that I feel like it complementary in combination with something else, because it goes back to, like you were saying, the speed thing. My personal opinion with a lot of the jiu-jitsu community, if you've never done lifting before and you're trying to do jiu-jitsu and you want to integrate like some type of strength training program, it goes back to what you say. You start with the mobility, make sure the prerequisites are there. And then if you're going to start some type of regimen, whatever, maybe squat, deadlift, whatever it is, you start on that high rep number, because it's more about learning the pattern.
Get more practice. Exactly.
You're learning the pattern and getting your tendon and your muscle tissue comfortable with the external load, because if you start with the mobility, it's internal and isometrics. So even though it's fatiguing and it's a neuromuscular kind of on the nervous system taxing, but it's not like micro tears on the actual muscle, actual fiber, where once you start doing external load, now you're going to start causing micro trauma to the muscle tissue. And what you want to do is start at the very beginning on the very high rep speed wise, and then slowly work your way down to that 5-3-1 method by increasing the load. And then in that middle ground is the dangerous zone, where you got to be careful of not hurting yourself. Like you got to go through let's say you're doing reps of 20 for 3 or 4 sets, you're going to get into that hypertrophy zone where you're doing 10 to 12 reps, where that's the danger zone, because you're doing maximal stress on the muscle, which if you're doing a lot of jiu-jitsu is where it's dangerous until you pass that zone, and then you get down into the power zone. But you got to go through that middle ground to kind of get to that power zone. So that's where, like, it goes back to what you were saying. You got to kind of figure out, like, what's the program for yourself for a year? Like, what's the long-term effect of what I want to do? And how do I want to periodize? Am I saying that right? Periodize, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say. Your program, so that you know that, like, okay, for the next 3 months, I'm going to work down to this number. And then this month, while I'm in that danger zone, I'm going to kind of tone back my jujitsu a little bit until I get out of it. And then I can start increasing the jujitsu program up again, because I'm down to the actual, like, the low rep, high load type of system in combination with the mobility. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. No, that's a great point. And that even goes back to, why it's so important to have those yearly, year, 2 year, 4, 6 year goals, right? Because with any sport, right? But definitely, I could definitely see that with jiu-jitsu, these high skill sports, it can be very tough to, like, I would say like rationalize, like, okay, I'm going to drop my frequency down to, maybe 2 less days per week or something like that. Cause you don't want to fall out of practice. You don't want to lose potential opportunities to gain skill. Right. But to be able to see a year ahead of time and be like, okay, at this time, I will be doing this type of program. It gets a lot easier to kind of rationalize, okay, like this month or these 2 months, I'm really focusing on strength, speed, and power, maybe picking up my conditioning, something like that. And then I'll be working on like specific skills, but your overall time in the gym may be less, right? You may be doing the practice less for that 1, 2, or 3 month period, so you can bring up other qualities, but knowing that you're going to get back to that level at an even higher, level, because now you have more strength, now you have more coordination, more conditioning, whatever your outcome is. But having that long-term plan makes it a lot easier to say, like, okay, let's dial it back a little bit so we can progress it, in a couple months.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. And I was talking to an athletic trainer who's a black belt about a week or 2 ago. And he made a comment on there, and I feel like he's right, but then he's right for, like, the middle belt color.
Okay.
To the advance, but at the very beginning, not so much. So, like, one of the things I ask is, like, hey, at what point do you know that you should do, like, a conditioning program? And his thought process was like, listen, it depends on who you're rolling with in jiu-jitsu in the gym. If you, let's say you're on a scale of 1 to 20, if you're like 18, 19, like, consistently with your rolls, then that's when you need to then not do a conditioning program. If you're breezing through your rolls and everyone is like, it's like you're like in cruise control, then that's when you need to, like, integrate a conditioning program. I think yes, but that's for somebody that is, like, I would say, like a higher level blue belt to a purple belt up until black belt, where I feel like when you're starting, you want to kind of, like, speed up the conditioning process, because of the fact that at the very beginning, when you've never done it before, there's a lot of nervous energy, especially when you first start rolling, a lot of nerve energy. It's different, like conditioning. There's nothing like it until you actually do it. And so I feel like if you're not doing a conditioning program at the very beginning, it's going to take you longer to adapt to that style of conditioning.
Yeah.
Where you can kind of reduce it a little bit by just doing a conditioning program. And then once you get your skill level to a certain point, then you're able to then go, okay, I'm already getting most of my conditioning from my training partners. I can let go of that, the conditioning program I did before. And then you just pull on that program whenever needed, depending on, because injuries happen, your rolling partners, whatever it may be, you may your roles may start to diminish a little bit. You may move, life gets in the way, and that's where you got to kind of pick up that program again.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. No, and that's something, actually just a couple of months ago finished you heard of BioForce? It's the BioForce, with Joel Jameson. He's worked with a lot of,
the HRV guys, right? The heart rate recovery, heart rate variability.
Yeah. So it's the BioForce conditioning certification, and that was another one. So where I look at, FRC kind of for joint training, right? Or in joint specific training. I look at more of the bioforce for the conditioning, right? And just like how mobility is a prerequisite to movement, you know, and to other things that you do with your body, right?
So
Conditioning is
hold that
really
thought so that people know. He's talking about Joel Jameson. It's
Joel Jameson.
he calls himself 8 weeks out. So it's
8 weeks out.
if you want to look him up, 8 weeks out.
So
I
I mean,
haven't taken his
so many
program.
articles.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
haven't personally taken his program, but I've seen a lot, like little snippets of his content. I attended a seminar about recovery, and he talked about HRV. So if it's
Yeah.
something that you think that you might need a conditioning program and you want additional information, like it's worth whatever amount of money that he charges, because it'll get you conceptually understanding what you need to do. But I'm
Yeah.
sorry,
No.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure people knew
No.
what you're talking about. Go ahead.
No worries. No, and that's and I want people to kind of look him up, you know, 8 weeks out. I mean, there's a bunch of articles because he really got into it. And he's done some podcasts where he tells a story where he was, you know, like a traditional strength coach and started working, you know, it's one of those things where someone was like, hey, like I got this like mixed martial, I think he was a UFC fighter, you know, to work with, never done UFC in his life, you know, didn't really know a whole lot about energy systems and things like that, and kind of threw himself into it. And that's kind of what I get, you know, more or less he's kind of known for now. And that's, so his conditioning certification is huge because it's all about, you know, energy systems from not only, you know, just like a general health perspective, but, you know, he'll look at different sports, you know, kind of these kind of like mixed sports. I mean, like jiu-jitsu is huge, right? Where you got to have the conditioning, you got to have that base to be able to sustain longer, you know, bouts of effort where you may be, you know, straining more, straining less, you know, doing, you know, utilizing different skills. So I really love that his conditioning certification, because you're looking at not only like the general aerobic foundation, but you're training, you know, like power, you're training, you know, intervals, you're doing high resistance intervals, you're doing these, you know, lactic, alactic, and it gets into very detailed perspective of like how the body works. And like you were saying, if you don't have a good aerobic system, you can't recover, you can't clear those like metabolic wastes that are going to happen, not only within your bout, but also from session to session, right? So the person that can recover better, or the person that has a higher aerobic capacity, can recover better, not only during the session, but from session to session. So like I was saying, like, well, I look at mobility as like the body prerequisite, having a good conditioning base is more of like the heart and lung prerequisite. So like you were saying, like, I would say from the start, I mean, that would be something like we talked about in the beginning of the call, like getting their assessment, looking at their joint assessment, like looking at how their body moves, but then I would take them through like a conditioning assessment, or maybe multiple like aspects of conditioning. So you may look at, you know, their power over time. You may look at, you know, their what's called like their anaerobic threshold, and different things to be able to identify where the weak link is, right? Because like you said, like as you get to higher levels, you know, you're rolling more, you're doing things that are hitting the aerobic foundation, but you may need to work on, you know, your conditioning at higher levels of, you know, your heart rate, you know, being able to sustain higher levels of, you know, higher intensity work. So as you get more advanced, just like with anything, you can start to like kind of nitpick and say, okay, I really need to focus on this. So maybe you're hitting that twice a week or once a week, you know, outside of your normal session. So that of any conditioning that I've seen, especially for jiu-jitsu, that kind of 8 weeks out, the whole, his method and model is like, I mean, huge. So that's something I definitely recommend people look at.
Yeah, and I was having the conversation with my buddy, with John Platero, the one, and he was telling me, because he's a cyclist, he's retired now, but he's an ex-pro cyclist,
Mm-hmm.
and he was explaining, he's like, man, jiu-jitsu, you guys are like in zone 5. He goes, so think about that. You're there, and you need to be comfortable with your heart rate being like at 85, 90% for like 2-minute runs.
Yeah.
And I was like, I go, yeah. He goes, so you got to kind of like understand, like you got to evaluate yourself and see where you're actually at, because it's not the 85 to 90%, of your maximum heart rate. He goes, it's how fast you can recover from that. He goes, you could be able to redline it. He goes, in cycling, the people that are at the top, like the Lance Armstrongs and blah, blah, blah. I don't know cyclists, athletes, but he said, those guys are, it's not that I can't compete with them. He goes, but when we go through like a 10 or 15 second cruise mode, it's like, I'm able to get my heart rate down to like 70%, where they're able to get back down to like 30% in order for them to rev right back up to like 90. He goes, that's where you got to kind of like now with all the wearable devices you can get,
Mm-hmm.
for any of the guys that are watching, for like high level athletes, you give yourself like a baseline, wear something and figure out like what, not only like what your average heart rate is while you're training, but how long does it take in between rounds, and
Yes.
for your heart to recover, and how fast does it recover when you're actually rolling? Because I know personally you get like that. I've gotten like, I'm not a high level guy, but I'm like in the middle ground right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm at the point now where I know where to kind of hang out. So like there's
Yeah.
certain points where you have to be really, really exerting a lot of energy. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, I can take a
Totally.
breath, take a diaphragm breath, take a relax for like 5 or 10 seconds, and then allows me to then recoup myself in order to start going again. So
Mm-hmm.
for anybody that's watching, you got to kind of start really contemplating like, how are you going to do your program for an annual basis? It's not always about more rounds. More is not always better. It's so funny that I say that about the conditioning, but Ospina just put up something on Instagram today about the mobility, that more is not better. It's about learning to
It's what you
control what
need,
you
right?
have.
Yeah.
Learn to control what you got. So not only at the joint level, but just like you said, you also got to do it like at the conditioning level as well. It's like how much do you have? How much of it do you have under control? And understand that there is ways that you can kind of tweak to kind of come up with some type of program in order for you
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get maximum return and the fastest recovery. Because it's not just about going up, it's about how fast can you recover in order for you to go right back up again.
Yeah, no, and just to kind of piggyback on that, now that I think about it, Joel Jamieson wrote a book. So if people like didn't want to go, take the course, take the certification, he wrote a book called, pretty sure it's called Ultimate MMA Conditioning, and it's not, not just about MMA, but it's a lot about kind of how to tailor your conditioning programs, right? Because I was guilty in the past, and just like I'm sure 99% of people are, like you look at whether you're doing strength training, you're monitoring your weights and your loads and stuff like that, but a lot of times with conditioning, it's like, okay, like I'm just going to go run 3 miles or 5 miles, or I'm going to go run stairs. You don't really have any form of feedback in terms of like where you're at, right? So like wearing the heart rate strap, wearing the wrist, like I wear like the Whoop, like it's not perfect, right? Like the chest straps are more specific in terms of like their accuracy, but just getting some feedback and some data on, like you said, like where's your heart rate, what's your average heart rate when you're, training, right? Or 60-second heart rate recovery is a big one. Like how quickly can you come back down to some form of baseline, right? So they call it, in the conditioning certification, they call it dynamic energy control, right? So it's really learning how to say like finish, like say a max effort 30-second sprint, and then now you got 1 minute to recover. Like that's a skill just like anything else, right? Being able to slow your heart rate down, being able to take big, deep belly breaths, like diaphragmatic breaths, and really bring down, kind of take some ownership of your physiology in a way, right? To be able to bring that heart rate down. And like you said, like if you're rolling, like that's a skill that you build, right? Where it's like, okay, you start to figure out times where you're not gonna be able to just like lay there and breathe, right? But you can do that within the practice of like, okay, I know I have this position, or have this opportunity, or if it's like in between rounds, something like that, to really bring your heart rate down. Because not only will you recover faster, you'll feel better, from a physical standpoint, but then what that does for your mental state probably is even more important.
And the average break between each round. So when you roll, just so because you don't know, when we roll like in class, when it's a rolling class, usually it's 6-minute rounds. Usually, every once in a while they'll raise it depending on how crazy the instructor wants to be. But usually it's 6-minute rounds, and there's usually about 1.5 to 2 minutes in between each round. So it's like a perfect
Yes.
system for you to figure out, like, hey, I'm going to do how fast of a sprint can I do in 6 minutes, and then how fast can I recover within one round to the next round. And
Absolutely.
it's great data for you to go, okay, I'm having problems here. I need to work on here. I need to do this. Like, why am I not redlining here? So it's like anything else. Just the more data you have, it allows you to come up with like some type of program, not only from the rate of perceived exertion, like I was telling you with that trainer was saying, that if you're like at 18, 19, it's great to like be able to like know 18, 19, but there's nothing like having like actual data that says, you know, like you were at 18, 19. Because sometimes your
Yeah.
mind will lie to you. You think you're at 18, 19 and you're like at 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
For
those
sure.
are the things that you kind of want to do. One of the things that I noticing also with a lot of the high level guys is caffeine and lack of sleep.
Yep. Yeah. And
That's a hard one to fix,
absolutely. Absolutely.
especially with when the athletes are traveling. They got a date that they got to perform at. You know,
Mhm.
it's hard for them to not be over caffeinated and underslept.
Yes. Absolutely. No, and that's something from just a nervous system standpoint, right? When you look at, you know, like it's like people, I mean, I don't want to say it's the same thing, but it's very similar when people look at like, oh yeah, like, you know, I took a sleeping pill or sleeping medication, I got 8 hours of sleep, but that's not the same as true deep sleep, right? So just because you're drinking caffeine and you feel like you're up and you're like, I'm ready to go, your nervous system may be saying something completely different, right? And that's where like an HRV kind of standpoint can kind of look, kind of play into things, right? Because you may feel energized because you know, drank a large coffee or whatever in the morning, but your HRV may be saying you're severely under recovered, right? So I mean, that's another kind of like reason to look at from the data standpoint.
So explain that a little bit. The HRV when it relates to because this is important. So the
Mm-hmm.
HRV, if I understood it correctly, because again I haven't taken this course, the HRV is basically the old method was just basically taking your resting heart rate. But
Yeah.
the HRV is the heart rate. It's basically like the mean between multiple days of your resting heart rate. Is that what I'm understanding?
So from how I understand it, HRV, so the heart rate variability is really it's the time between heartbeats, right? So you have like, say like, you know, from one heartbeat to the next, it's going to measure like that amount of time, right?
Okay.
So the higher, it's actually relates to higher heart rate variability, higher HRV responds to greater parasympathetic activity, right? So you want to, like, especially with like people that live, you know, in today's day and age, we spend, you know, 10, 12 hours a day in a very sympathetic state, right? That kind of fight or flight state. And that's that state where we're not going to recover, right? So that's showing we're in a very like, it's the fight or flight, right? So then you have the parasympathetic state, which is the heart, which is a rest, digest, and relax kind of state, right? So so HRV is telling us essentially where your nervous system is at kind of on the spectrum of recovery, right? So I'm pretty sure it's like a 1 to 100 kind of mark. And I think like 75 and above is usually where you want to be. Like, so, and that's where like, and it's tough because like true HRV, you would want to get like first thing in the morning, like before you've done really anything. Cause say you wake up and you're feeling good, but then you have like meetings and all these stressful things, you have family stuff, and like you take your HRV at 2 in the afternoon, it's gonna be a lot different than it would be at 7 in the morning. So from what I understand, like, you know, taking it first thing in the day is gonna be better. But that's one thing like Whoop does is gives you kind of like an average HRV. So it's not perfect, but it does at least give you some frame of reference into kind of
Your baseline, yeah.
where your nervous system is at. So so it really comes down to like time between heartbeats, and the higher your variability, the more recovered you are, really, to kind of put it in general terms. So that's the only thing we're saying was like, you could feel good, you could have energy from artificial sources and stuff like that and feel pretty good, but your HRV may say something completely different. So and there's a lot of data, there's a lot of like wearable things out now that where you can take, you know, HRV measurements. But that would be something that I tell people, it's like a resting heart rate is like the foundational one that I would give people. So if I'm working with someone who's like just wants to feel better, wants to perform better, you know, looking at your resting heart rate in the morning is like a good baseline thing to get, right? Because especially if you're monitoring it, you know, and it's like 65, 72, right? It's like, okay, maybe today we don't go quite as hard, right? But then for someone who, you know, is competing, or someone who wants to do really well, maybe they're a professional, maybe, you know, there's someone who's, you know, like really putting a lot into this, which I'm sure a lot of people do. HRV would be the kind of the next step up, because now that's getting more specific in terms of like what the nervous system is telling us.
Like that. So let me recap a little bit to what you said, just to make sure I understood.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, guys. So basically, he killed two birds with one stone there. He basically said for the average jiu-jitsu person that comes in and is not like a competitor, you want to start with your resting heart rate in the morning. So figure out what your resting heart rate is, figure out what your average resting heart rate is, and then if it's elevated, then either you didn't sleep right, or you didn't eat right, or you trained really hard and your body hasn't recovered, and then that dictates what you're going to do for the day. In other words, you're going to kind of adjust how strenuous your activity will be. Or if you're the competitor, you're going to level up from there, because the resting heart rate is not specific enough. It's not detailed enough in order for you to get the true number for you, because you're training at a higher level. Then you're going to go for the HRV method, which Google it. You'll probably find a bunch of content out there that you can find the process to do it. And then that'll tell you like what you need to do for that day. And that's a good way of looking at it. Like give yourself information. Like sometimes, like I even notice it sometimes too, where, and it goes back to like just being into a sport. When you love it so much, you kind of like ignore like the indicators of telling you like slow down, because you have this like, you have this like, I don't know how it is with women. I'm just talking as a guy. Like you have this like mental thing, like, you know, don't be a punk. Like you gotta, let's take an energy drink. Let's have some caffeine. Let's just go bang out some rolls. But sometimes that could be, you know, it's counterproductive. You know, it can be counterproductive, not always counterproductive, but it can be counterproductive. And it could be because it could be because you just didn't recover properly. There could be a lot of reasons. And that's why you want to try to get as much data as possible and have a program as effective as possible for you, in order for you to have like the longevity in jiu-jitsu. Because
huge
for people that are watching, it's like, dude, you realize if you're a white belt, you got 10 years before you're a black belt. And even when you become a black belt, there's levels to black belts. So like at the end of the day, it's a lifelong thing. And if you want to be doing this for the rest of your life with as little as injury as possible, with as a good of quality of life as you possibly can, you got to start really treating yourself as a science project and figuring out like, what is it that I need? What is it that can I do to make sure that I stick with that program? It's not just about learning jiu-jitsu, even though that is important. Obviously, the more you learn, the better you're going to get. I get that. But I'm talking because I've seen it personally, where you see a young person that is, you know, a very committed athlete that's like 21, and then by the time he's 28, he's banged up. He doesn't sleep good. He's over caffeinated. You know, he's got all kinds of joint issues. And yeah, the guy's one of the best jiu-jitsu people in the world, which is fantastic. Guy can train with you, but think about it, when you're 40 or 50 or 60, you're going to have all kinds of issues for no reason. And for those that are watching, that are a little bit older when they started, you're getting older, dude. Like you gotta respect it. Like I respect it now. Like I have to like be a little bit more on myself. Like before, like I knew my body well enough to where I could kind of gauge how I felt, how I trained, because I had already done like the previous programming. But now that I've gotten older, I've rounded 40 now. I now have to be like, okay, man, like I have to plan out like how I'm training, because there was times where I was literally mental toughness. Like I would feel like I got hit by a truck. And I'm like, man, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I'm eating right. I'm getting the proper amount of sleep. Like what do I need to adjust? And those are things in order for you to like be able to like train consistently. And as you progress, it gets harder, guys. When you're a white belt, it's easy. The better you get, the better players you get, which means it's more physically taxing. So you're going to have to really adjust and think of your programming in a way that is going to maximize your results and improve your recovery so that you can continue doing it on a consistent basis. Cool. What about food, man? Explain to me a little bit about food. Like, what do you do with people with food?
Yeah. So really my philosophy on nutrition is really trying to make it as simplified as possible, right? So just like with training, you know, we're looking at what your goals are, where you're starting, where you're at, right? So if you're someone who wants to lose a bunch of weight and you've never done anything from like a nutritional standpoint, we may be, doing a significant amount of coaching, just like someone who's never trained before in their life, that's going to take more one-on-one, like specific focused attention. But really my philosophy is just focusing on as much whole, unprocessed foods as possible, really just trying to get more protein, especially, depending on your body weight and your body composition, your training goals, but, protein, lean protein, healthy proteins, as much fruits and vegetables as possible, healthy, nuts, seeds, olive oil, those types of things. Like people have this very, I won't call it divisive, pretty, people come to with nutrition with a lot of their preconceived notions, right? So it's like, oh, like I want to lose weight, so I'm just going to stop eating carbs, and like, especially someone like jiu-jitsu, it's like, please don't do that, right? So it's like, or people are like, oh, like, like fats are so bad for you, right? And it's like, well, certain types of fats, right? Or like certain amounts, right? Or things like that, right? So really trying to kind of help people kind of create a frame for nutrition that's not, it's not about, say, avoiding certain things or not eating bad foods, things like that, but really just trying to focus on as much healthy options as possible, create the largest amount of proportion within their meals as they can. And then, people are all just going to, they're going to eat out, they're going to, have large quantities of food, whether they're eating with family and stuff like that. But it's not about like taking away everything that they enjoy, right? But it's about having a greater proportion, greater kind of ratio of leaner, healthier, high quality foods. And then, still having some space for them to do and eat what they enjoy, right? Because everyone's going to come with different histories, backgrounds, and emotional attachments to food. So really looking at it from a, yes, one, what is your goal? But two, like, where are you starting at? Like, what's your baseline? And like, where do you want to go?
Yeah. So I agree 1000% with everything you just said. So the way I tell people is, at least at the very beginning, if you've never actually done any type of activity before, I tell everybody, don't try to remove, add the good stuff. And the stuff that you don't want to eat, it will start to fall off on its own. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with you that your goal should be 100% real food that's unprocessed. If you can just do that, that's like 80% of the battle. The other 20% is figuring out what works best for you. I also think boring is better. Usually I try to tell people, try to stick to like a boring, very
simple,
very similar, simple, actionable thing that you can kind of schedule Monday through Friday, and then kind of ease up a little bit on the weekend, because like you said, you want to go out to dinner with your girlfriend, wife, husband, whatever, friends. You also don't want to restrict your life to where you can't have a life when it comes to going out to eat, because the whole idea is to create a lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Specifically for jiu-jitsu guys, is carbohydrates are our friend. Yes. So that notion of like what's popular now is not eating carbohydrate is the worst fucking thing you can do as a jiu-jitsu person. You're going to feel like garbage. Yes, you will lose weight, but you will feel like trash. You understand that we're at high level conditioning. It's lots of sugar.
Tapping into that. Yeah.
Like, tapping into that sugar. Your body needs carbohydrates. So when someone tells me like, oh yeah, I cut carbohydrates, it's the worst thing you can do for yourself. A little bit different when you're talking like on the athlete side, because usually sometimes they have to make weight. So there's a little bit of play with that. I usually recommend, if someone is on the athlete side, hire a dietitian. Get someone to kind of design like something that can kind of tweak it, because the dietitian is going to say, okay, you have 6 weeks or 8 weeks. This is what I recommend. They're going to do a whole caloric breakdown. They're going to do a percentage of what you're doing. They're going to be very specific. And then they're going to kind of reevaluate exactly where you're at according to your weight loss. So if you're an athlete doing jiu-jitsu and you got to make weight for a specific event, because that event's going to pay you, don't try to wing the shit yourself. Spend the money. It's worth the money, at least if you've never done it before, because you also don't want to hurt yourself, because cutting weight is not good for you either. It's extremely taxing on your body. So a registered dietitian can kind of teach you how to cut weight, efficiently, as well as you don't want to do it too often, because then you create like a yo-yo effect on your body where you shed off like 20, 30 pounds, and then right out, as soon as you do that event, boom, you shoot right back up. That's not good for you either. So just be mindful that you want to try to create a lifestyle change where you're doing it again. It goes back to the same thing with the training. It's like think year, think 2 year, think 4 year. You know, you want to be able to walk around at your weight normally. So if you compete at 181, you should be able to comfortably walk around at 183, 185. So that if you've got an event coming, all you got to do is go for a run and you're golden, which is great. You shut off a little bit of water weight. But I feel like a lot of the guys will force their body into a position to where it's dangerous, you know, especially in the MMA world. Jiu-jitsu, not so much. Jiu-jitsu, because you compete like at the moment that you weigh in. MMA, they do it like boxing, where it's like the day before. That's when it goes, it's crazy.
30 pounds.
30, 40 pounds. You're like, oh my God,
nuts.
in like 4 weeks. Like, what?
Yeah.
So just understand that, guys, whoever's watching this is try to create a meal regimen that's a lifestyle regimen, so that 95% of the time of your daily routine you're going to stick to. And then that 5% is, I want a fucking donut. Go eat a donut. You want to have a pizza because you had a really hard training day? Go have the pizza. Just understand that you're able to cook that cushion, because 95% of the time you created a whole unprocessed food diet in order for you to follow. And then whatever your weight adjusts to is whatever your weight adjusts to. And that's the weight you compete at. I had a conversation, just so you know, with a girl, and I can only imagine what it's like for women. She's a big girl. She's like 5'9". She walks around at like 185 pounds, she weighs 15 pounds less than me, and I'm only an inch taller than her. So she's a relatively big girl, and she was a competitive wrestler, and she actually ended up getting she was on the Olympic track to wrestle, and she ended up having like an eating problem because she was cutting weight so much that and as a woman, I can only imagine, because it's also society pressure of what a woman is supposed to look like. So comes to the mental aspect as well as the athletes, is sometimes don't get focused on what it looks like in the mirror. Focus on the outcome of performance. So if you feel good, who cares if you look good, if your goal is to be the best at jiu-jitsu. Whatever your body adjusts to is what your body adjusts to. It's like I can't tell people, like, forget about what the mirror says. Forget about what the scale says. It's like, do the things properly. And if you do the things properly, your body will adjust, and it'll optimize itself for what you're telling it. And the science says, do this, so fucking do that. And then whatever that body looks like is what you should be competing at, and how you should be doing it, because you're not doing it for today. Forget about the outcome for today. You got to look at it as a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan, because especially for the high-level jiu-jitsu competitors, is you're competing not only because you love the sport, but eventually you're doing this for a career. And know that once you get that 10 years in for a black belt, you got another 10, 15, 20 years. Either you're going to start your own gym, or you're going to still compete. So if you don't create those habits, you're going to have just a disastrous career of like just feeling like dog shit all the time, which is what we want to hopefully avoid by us having this conversation and educate the average person, you know?
Absolutely.
Cool, brother. How do people find you, bro?
On Instagram, Nowland_performance, NOWLAND. And then you can look me up Facebook, just Luke Nowland. I got a YouTube page, but that's, it's pretty much a lot of the same stuff that you'll find on my Instagram. That's where I put kind of a lot of my videos, a lot of my kind of main hub of my content. And, that's really the main two would be Facebook and Instagram.
Cool, brother. Thanks for tuning in, guys. And comment below or whatever. You know what to do. Ask me questions. Ask Luke questions. Don't be afraid. I mean, we're here to help. That's the point of it.
Hit me up anytime.
Whether you go to Nowland or you come to me or you go to anybody, the internet is a wonderful thing. There's a bunch of information out there. Give us comments here, because it's going to help me continue increasing more content in the future. Keep in mind that I'm going to be doing another one with that functional medicine doctor with an athletic trainer interview. That's going to be more detailed on studies that they're actually done with jiu-jitsu practitioners. We're going to go through 11 studies that they actually went through. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, follow Nowland. on Instagram. Ask him questions. Follow our content. We're here to help you out. Us guys, thanks so much.